They never meant for you to hear this story. It was meant to rot quietly beneath the soil of Georgia, buried with the ledgers they tried to burn, sealed beneath the foundations of a plantation that no longer exists on any official map. But the name Belmont still appears, faintly, on an 1856 land deed stored in the Savannah Courthouse archives. A name scratched out once, then written again in a different hand, and under that, the signature of a woman who bought a child no one else wanted. It began on a morning thick with insects and judgment. The crowd gathered before sunrise, men in linen coats, women fluttering fans like nervous birds. They came to purchase bodies. Efficient, obedient, dark-skinned bodies. But what they saw that morning froze even their cruelty into silence. A boy, no older than 11, stood trembling on the block, skin pale as candle wax, eyes the color of milk and iron mixed, hair that looked white but glowed faintly gold in the sun. They called him cursed, a ghost born. Even the auctioneer's voice faltered when he read the bill of sale. No one wanted him. Not because they pitied him, but because they feared him. The bidding fell like dying breath. 2015 10 5, then silence, until a single fan rose, slow as a verdict. The woman behind it was enormous, dressed in black silk that shimmered like oil on water. Her name was Margaret Denore, a widow, landowner, scholar, and something else. Something she hid behind the performance of Christian charity. The crowd cheered her generosity. They didn't see the calculation in her eyes. They didn't know she had been searching for a child like this for years, a body with pure recessive blood. That boy, they said his name was Thomas, disappeared that day into Margaret's carriage. None of the witnesses would ever see him again. But someone found what she left behind: her journals, her charts, her diagrams of purification. She wrote about a new kind of human, about selection, refinement, erasure, and what began as one woman's obsession would become the seed of something larger. Something that still breathes beneath the language of progress today. The carriage that carried Thomas away from the city moved like a coffin on wheels. Each turn of the road took him farther from the world of men and deeper into something unseen, something designed. Margaret Denore sat opposite him, her face half shadowed beneath her black hat, eyes fixed not on him, but through him, as if measuring the space he occupied against some invisible formula. She didn't speak for miles. She didn't have to. Power doesn't explain itself. It simply waits for you to understand who owns you. When they reached the edge of her land, the air changed. The pines grew denser, the sound of insects dulled. The sun itself seemed to avoid certain corners of the property, leaving whole fields in permanent twilight. Belmont was no ordinary plantation. It was an experiment, a living laboratory disguised as Christian enterprise. And within its boundaries, Margaret's word was not law. It was doctrine. She led Thomas into a small building that smelled of pine and chalk. The walls were too clean, the bed too neat. On the table sat a single book, Natural Philosophy and the Improvement of Species, open to a page marked Hereditary Purification. She told him this would be his room, that he would eat, sleep, and learn here. He was to obey without question. In exchange, he would be treated well. That night, while he sat awake on the edge of the mattress, he heard footsteps above him, then a faint scraping sound. Metal against stone, like something being wheeled across the floor. He didn't yet know that directly beneath his room was the chamber where she kept her instruments, measuring rods, scales, and glass jars labeled with single initials. Every sound in that place had purpose. Every silence was a test. Margaret believed fear was the first step toward obedience. She didn't beat her subjects. She conditioned them. Deprivation, isolation, reward, repetition. Psychological levers refined long before the science had a name. She called it alignment, the reshaping of will to fit her design. Thomas was the first subject marked for complete alignment. His body was her specimen, his mind her proving ground. And on the first night he tried to pray, no words came out. Only breath, shallow trembling, counted, because she had already started to take his voice. You said based on real or mythic dark history. Start with a disturbing, cinematic hook in the first 8 seconds that instantly pulls the viewer into mystery and unease. Like a secret they were never meant to hear. Structure the script into 15 powerful sections, each with 400 words of spoken text only, no labels, no extras. The content should explore forbidden history, hidden agendas, psychological control systems, suppressed truths, ancient corruption, and institutional manipulation. The tone must be serious, mysterious, and emotionally intense, but with a darker, more commanding, power-based voice than liturgy of fear. Speak to the viewer like a mentor revealing truths they were never supposed to know. Someone pulling them down the rabbit hole, not just telling stories but awakening awareness. Halfway through the video, ask viewers to comment a symbolic phrase twice to lock in identity transformation and algorithm engagement. Audience: men aged 18 to 69 in the USA, obsessed with secrets, hidden forces, self-mastery, and elite knowledge. Every section must deepen the descent, like falling further into the forbidden, one revelation at a time. Write as if this is dangerous knowledge, the kind that changes a man forever once he hears it. Generate the script one section at a time, and label clearly Section 1, Section 2, etc. Keep it tight, cinematic, emotionally heavy, psychologically sharp, and saturated with truths hidden in plain sight. Pete below move video topic. The albino slave boy no one wanted, until the plantation's most powerful woman took him in. Heat competitor title. No master wanted albino slave boy, until obese plantation lady bought him for herself. Heen transcript or source for ideas. Optional but powerful. Low 100. On a humid August morning in 1855, a child stood on an auction block in 005 Savannah, Georgia, and not a single person wanted to buy him. His pale skin, 10, and colorless eyes marked him as cursed, dangerous, a bearer of bad luck that no 116 plantation owner would risk bringing onto their property. The bidding started at 20 dias, then 15, then 10. Finally, at 25, just 5 of one woman raised her fan. Margaret Dunor, widow who owned 4,032 acres 12 miles outside the city, paid 12 out of what she called Christian 38 charity. The crowd applauded her generosity. What they did not know was 43, that Margaret had been searching for a child exactly like this one for 3 years. What they could not have imagined was 150, that 73 people would disappear on her property over the next 14 years, their fates documented in ledgers that local Low and 57 authorities allegedly burned in 1861. But one ledger survived, hidden in a 104 foundation wall, discovered during highway construction in 1959. Inside 109 were measurements, bloodline charts, and something called the Purification Project. 1:16 before we continue with the story of what happened to that albino boy and the hidden compound where Margaret conducted, 1:22, her experiments. I need to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because we 1:29 and uncover the mysteries that history tried to bury. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you are 1:36 listening from. We want to know where our audience is hearing these dark stories. Now, let me take you back to 1:43, that sweltering afternoon when a widow's terrible vision began to take shape. The 1:48 summer heat in Savannah felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the crowd gathered near the waterfront slave 1:54 market. Margaret Dunor arrived in her carriage, alone as always, a massive 200 woman whose size commanded attention in an era when such girth signaled wealth and power. At 47 years old, she had been 209 a widow for 13 years, running her late husband's plantation with an iron will 2014 that made overseers nervous and neighbors wary. But what truly set Margaret apart was 21, not her appearance or her business acumen. It was the library she had assembled over the past decade, over 329 books on natural philosophy, anatomy, and animal husbandry, with a particular 235 focus on breeding techniques and hereditary science. The boy brought to the platform that day was perhaps 11 to 41 years old, so thin his ribs showed through his shirt, but it was his coloring that made the crowd fall 248 silent. His skin appeared almost translucent in the harsh sunlight. His 253 hair was white blonde and sparse, and his eyes held a pinkish-gray quality 258 that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The auctioneer, a professional named Cyrus Pitton, 3705, struggled to hide his discomfort. Lot 47, he announced without his usual 3-10 enthusiasm. Malachild, approximately 11 years from the Hutchinson estate near 316 Augusta. As you can see, he has a particular condition, albinism. The word 3021 was not spoken aloud, but everyone understood. In 1855, Georgia, such 327 children carried heavy superstitious weight among both white and enslaved communities. Many believed they brought 3-33 crop failures, that they could see ghosts, that they were marked by divine punishment. The mixing of African and 3741 European ancestry was common enough on plantations, but albinism created an 3047 uncomfortable ambiguity that defied the racial categories upon which the entire system depended. When bidding opened at 354.20, not a single hand rose. P-Ton lowered it repeatedly until reaching 5402, still nothing. People turned away, some making signs against evil. That was when 408. Margaret raised her fan with deliberate slowness, her expression serene. The 4013 crowd turned to stare. 5 to Mrs. Denore, Peaton said quickly, relieved. 4019 to have any bid. Going once, going twice. Margaret stood, opening 427, her purse with theatrical generosity. I will pay 12 for the poor child, she 433 announced loudly. It is our Christian duty to care for those whom others 438 reject. Several women nodded approvingly. An elderly gentleman called 443 out. God bless you, Mrs. Denore. She acknowledged the praise with a gracious smile, the very picture of benevolent 451 Christianity. But as the boy was led to her carriage, her eyes studied him with the cold 4157 calculation of a naturalist examining a rare specimen. She had finally found 5502 what she needed, subject 0 for her purification project. The boy, whose 508 previous owners had called him Thomas, sat pressed into the corner of the carriage during the journey to Belmont 514 Plantation. Margaret said nothing to him, but she opened a leather journal and began writing observations: his 5-21 approximate age, the specific shade of his skin and hair, the color of his eyes 5027 in different light, the size of his hands and feet. She worked methodically, 5032, occasionally looking up to measure him with her gaze before returning to her notes. Augustus, Margaret's driver, had 5040 worked for the Denore family for over 20 years. His shoulders were tense, his jaw 5046 tight. He had learned long ago not to question what Margaret did. Belmont had 551, a reputation among the enslaved community in Chatham County. People went there and simply vanished, not escaped, 558, because word usually spread about runaways being captured. These people ceased to exist, as if they had never 606 been born. The carriage rolled through pine forest, toward a part of Belmont that Thomas would soon know too well, a 6712 collection of buildings hidden nearly a mile from the main house, accessible only by a narrow road through thick 61 Dean woods. These structures had been built between 1843 and 1852 using materials 6725, purchased in small quantities from different suppliers across 3 states. The workers who constructed them had 632 been sold immediately after completion, dispersed to plantations so far apart they would never meet to compare 638 stories. When Augustus stopped the carriage in front of the largest building, Margaret 6044 climbed down and beckoned Thomas to follow. The interior was unlike anything he had ever seen. Clean pine floors, 652 whitewashed walls, glass windows. Margaret led him to a small room containing a bed with an actual 658 mattress, a chair, a table with a basin, and a shelf. This will be your room, 7-4, she said, her cultured voice carrying no warmth. You will be provided with adequate food, clothing, and shelter. 713 in return, you will cooperate with certain procedures, medical examinations, measurements, 720 observations. Do you understand? Thomas nodded, understanding nothing except that 7026 survival meant obedience. Can you read? He shook his head. Can you 7-32 write? Another shake. You will be taught, Margaret said with satisfaction. 739, you will learn to read, write, and understand natural philosophy. 745, these lessons begin tomorrow. You may ask questions about your lessons, but 750, you will not ask questions about anything else you see or hear. You will not speak to others without permission. 757, you will not attempt to leave. If you obey, you will be treated well. If you 872 disobey, punishments will be severe. Do you understand? Thomas nodded again, his 8009 thin body trembling. Margaret locked the door from the outside when she left. Thomas stood motionless for a long time, 8016, before finally sitting on the edge of the mattress. He could not lie down. Instead, he sat with his back against 8C23, the wall, knees drawn to his chest, waiting for whatever would come next. In 8C28, the cool basement of another building, Margaret lit oil lamps and opened a journal. She dipped her pen in ink and 8:35 began writing in neat, precise script. August 17, 1855. 8-41 Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Initial observations suggest excellent quality for the purification project. 8-49 Pure albinism evident in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary measurements tomorrow, followed by 8056 educational assessment. Subject 0 represents the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build. If 903 theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. She 99 continued writing for another hour, documenting every detail she had observed about Thomas. To Margaret, he 1915 was not a person. He was the key to unlocking what she believed were the secrets of human heredity, and she would 9722 spend the next 4 years preparing him for a role so disturbing that when the truth finally emerged, it would haunt 929 Chatham County for generations. Thomas's days at Belmont followed a 9-10-35 rigid schedule that Margaret enforced with absolute consistency. He woke each 9:40 morning at 600 when Margaret herself unlocked his door, a routine she maintained to establish her complete 946 authority. She would enter with measuring tape and notebook, recording his height against 9051 marks on the door frame. Once per week, she weighed him on a scale imported from 957 Philadelphia. Once per month, she performed a complete physical examination that lasted over an hour, Tunhayo 4 measuring every aspect of his development with clinical precision. After morning measurements, Thomas 10-10 received breakfast, cornmeal mush, occasionally supplemented with milk or molasses. Margaret had calculated 2017 precise caloric intake necessary for optimal growth. At 700, his education 122 began. Margaret had hired a tutor, a nervous young man from Savannah named Christopher Vance, who came twice weekly 10-30 to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Vance believed he was participating in progressive research 736, testing whether enslaved children could learn academic subjects. He had no idea Tunhe 41 about Margaret's broader project. Thomas proved an exceptional student, absorbing Tunhe 46 information with impressive speed. By the end of his first year, he could read complex texts, write in clear Tun 753 handwriting, and perform advanced mathematics. Margaret seemed pleased, though her satisfaction manifested as 759 clinical approval rather than warmth. She assigned him books from her library, anatomical texts with detailed 1106 illustrations, agricultural manuals about livestock breeding, natural philosophy books discussing heredity, and 111013 variation. But the true purpose of his education became clear during Margaret's private 111018 lessons. She would sit across from Thomas in one of the compound schoolrooms, anatomy charts hanging between 11s and 25 them, and explain her theories. She showed him how characteristics passed 11s and 30 from parents to children, displayed charts documenting horse breeding, and explained how desirable traits could be 1137, concentrated through careful selection. Then she would transition, her voice never-changing tone, to human heredity. 1145, she explained her belief that races represented different developmental stages, that characteristics like 1151 intelligence and beauty were inherited, and could be improved through selective breeding. Thomas listened with his face 1157 impassive, his pale eyes fixed on the charts. He had learned that interrupting 12,003 brought sharp rebukes. Margaret never struck him. She did not need to. The 1208 isolation and total control she exercised were punishment enough. He was allowed contact with no one except 1214 Margaret, Vance, and occasionally Augustus, who brought supplies, but never spoke beyond necessary words. What 1222 Thomas did not yet understand was that Margaret was preparing him for a specific role. She was educating him not 1229 from progressive ideals, but because she needed him to comprehend what would eventually be required. She needed him 1236 to understand heredity, to grasp why certain pairings produced certain results, to appreciate the significance 12I43 of her experiment. Because eventually, when he matured, he would become not just a subject of observation, but an 1250 active participant in creating what Margaret called her improved line. The 1256 compound held others beyond Thomas, though he rarely saw them. Through his window, he sometimes glimpsed people 1303 move in between buildings under escort. He heard voices, occasionally muffed 1308 through walls. At night, sometimes there were sounds that disturbed him, crying, 1313 screaming, or long silences that felt worse. He learned never to ask about these things. Margaret maintained 1320 approximately 25 people in the compound at any time, though specific individuals 1325 changed frequently. She acquired them through various means, purchasing those 1330 with particular characteristics, accepting people other owners wanted to dispose of, occasionally bringing in 1338 people from her main plantation when they exhibited traits she wanted to study. These people lived in communal 13744 rooms, sleeping on pallets given adequate food and shelter, but kept in complete isolation from the outside 1350 world. Margaret maintained detailed records on each person, measurements, 1355 health status, family history if known, and specific characteristics she deemed 1400 desirable or undesirable. She arranged pairings with cold calculation, keeping charts that tracked 1407 which combinations produced children with which traits. Over 13 years, she 14s and 13 had documented dozens of births, but the records also showed something darker. A 1418 high mortality rate, especially among infants, and numerous disappearances. The 1424 truth about these disappearances was perhaps the darkest aspect. When children were born with what Margaret 1430 called degenerate characteristics, severe deformities, or health problems, they did not survive long. Her records 14,037 noted they failed to thrive or expired due to natural weakness, but witnesses 1444 who came forward after Margaret's death told different stories. They described infants taken away shortly after birth, 1451, and never seen again. They described a small cemetery deep in the pine forest, 1456, marked only by numbered wooden stakes. They described the copper-lined basement 1501, where Margaret preserved biological specimens in alcohol jars, including some that appeared disturbingly human. 1510 Thomas knew none of this during his early years. His world consisted of his room, the schoolroom, the examination 15,018 room, and occasionally the yard where Margaret allowed him supervised exercise. She maintained his health 1524 carefully, ensuring adequate nutrition, fresh air, and physical activity. But at 1530 was livestock management, not compassion. As Thomas approached his 14th birthday in 1857, Margaret's 1537 lessons took on new dimensions. She began explaining reproductive biology in 1542 explicit detail using anatomical charts and preserved specimens. She discussed 1548 conception, gestation, and birth with clinical precision. She explained genetic inheritance with growing 1554 emphasis on his unique characteristics. You represent something remarkable, she 1600 told him during one lesson, her eyes studying him with calculating intensity. 1605 Your albinism is a pure expression of recessive characteristics. If paired 16710 correctly with subjects possessing complementary traits, the offspring would be invaluable for understanding 1616 hereditary mechanisms. You are not simply a subject to be observed, Thomas, you are the key to the next phase of 16723 this research. Thomas was intelligent enough to understand what she suggested, and the knowledge filled him with 1630 profound dread. But he had nowhere to run. The compound was surrounded by 35 miles of forest patrolled by overseers with dogs. Even if he escaped, where 1641 would an albino teenage boy go in 1857 Georgia? He would be captured 16746, immediately returned, punished severely. Margaret owned him as 1652, completely as she owned her furniture, and the law supported her absolute right to do anything she wanted. But during 1658, his recovery from a serious bout of pneumonia in spring 1858, something unexpected occurred. Augustus, 1706, the driver, began speaking to him during supply deliveries. Brief conversations, 1712, never more than a few sentences, always when Margaret was absent. Augustus would 1718 ask how Thomas felt, comment on weather, mention small details about life outside the compound. These tiny human 1725 connections after years of isolation and clinical treatment affected Thomas 1730 profoundly. One afternoon in June 1858, as Thomas sat in the yard regaining his strength, 1738, Augustus brought supplies and lingered. You know she won't stop, he said 1743 quietly. Whatever she planning, she won't stop. But you smarter than most. 1748, you've been learning from her books. Maybe you can figure something she can't. Before Thomas could respond, 1755, Augustus moved away. But the words planted something in Thomas's mind. For 3 years he had been passive, accepting his fate because he saw no alternative. 1875, but Augustus was right. He could read. He had access to Margaret's library. He 1811 understood more about her theories than she realized. And if he was careful, patient, and clever, perhaps he could 1818 find a way to use that knowledge. As summer arrived and Thomas's health returned, Margaret resumed her lessons 1824 with renewed intensity. She informed him that the following year, when he turned 15, he would begin the next phase. She 1832 had identified several women in the compound with what she called optimal characteristics, and Thomas would be 1839 paired with them to produce children that could be studied from birth. She 1844 explained this with clinical detachment, as if discussing crop rotation, rather 1850 than the systematic exploitation of a teenage boy. Thomas listened, nodded 1855 and said nothing, but behind his pale eyes something had changed. He was no 1901 longer just a passive subject. He was planning, and as he lay in his room each 1906 night, he began to understand that knowledge could be a weapon. Margaret had educated him as part of her 19Z12 experiment, never considering that education might give him tools to resist. It was a mistake that would 1911 eventually unravel everything she had built. The autumn of 1858 brought an unexpected complication. Dr. Harrison, 19,027, Pembroke arrived at Belmont on October 12 unannounced and carrying a letter of introduction from the Medical Society, 1934 of Charleston. Pembroke, a rising figure in Southern medical circles, had developed a fascination with hereditary 1940 pathologies. He had heard rumors of Margaret's private research facility and traveled from South Carolina 1946, specifically to meet her. Margaret received him in the main house, serving tea while assessing this unexpected 1953 visitor. Pembroke was 42, tall and thin, with angular features and hands that 1959 moved constantly as he spoke. He had studied medicine in Philadelphia before returning to Charleston to establish a 2006 practice. But his true passion was research. He showed Margaret his published papers on hereditary illness, Twentelsinfirktu, his theories about racial characteristics, his belief that scientific breeding could improve human 20-scene Lendine stock. The future of medicine lies not in treating illness after it appears, 22-24 Pembroke explained enthusiastically, but in preventing weak bloodlines from reproducing. 20-31 Imagine a world where hereditary diseases are eliminated through careful selection, where each generation is 20-38 stronger than the last. This is achievable through systematic breeding principles. 20-44 Margaret listened, calculating rapidly. Pembroke represented both opportunity 20,050 and threat, an opportunity because his medical expertise exceeded hers, and he 2056 might advance her research. A threat because he might discover the full scope 2101 of her experiments and react with moral objection. Many physicians espoused 2107 eugenic theories abstractly, but might balk at practical applications. Your ideas are fascinating, Dr. 2014 Pembroke, she said carefully. I have maintained some observations of heredity 2119 among the enslaved population here. Nothing as systematic as your research, perhaps, but enough to convince me that 2126 animal husbandry principles do apply to human beings. Pembroke leaned forward, 2131 eyes bright. I would be honored to see your work. Perhaps I might contribute observations that could advance both our 2139 studies. ChatGPT said, excellent. You've defined the perfect framework and energy for this project. Before I generate section 1, the opening 400 words, can I confirm a few production details so that the tone, pacing, and delivery align with your dark, cinematic intent? Narration voice. Should it sound like a documentary prophet as calm, reverent, low-tone menaces, or like a psychological mentor as closer, more conspiratorial, almost whispering forbidden truth to the viewer? The factual versus mythic balance. Do you want the Albino slave boy story treated as historical realism, with grounded archival tone and pseudo-records, or as mythic forbidden history, hinting at occult, esoteric eugenics, secret orders, etc.? Level of dangerous knowledge. Should the revelations lean more toward psychological and societal manipulation, mind control, human experimentation, power systems, or toward occult and metaphysical implications, purification rituals, bloodline mysticism, ancient doctrine reborn in the antebellum South? Once you choose those three tones, I'll immediately generate section 1, the cinematic opening hook, a first 400 spoken words that begins with that disturbing secret the audience was never meant to hear. You said next section in 400-word. ChatGPT said perfect. To make sure I match the exact tone, before I generate section 2, could you confirm which direction you want me to take from here? Do you want real-world psychological horror, the continuing descent into Margaret's purification project, showing her power systems, mind control, and early manipulations of Thomas, occult forbidden layer, revealing that her science is mixed with ancient or ritualistic influences, bloodlines, esoteric purification doctrine, etc.? Hybrid, grounded historical realism, but with subtle undertones hinting at occult or metaphysical origins of her project, without ever naming them directly. Once you pick one, I'll deliver section 2, 400 words immediately. Same cinematic, dangerous, mentor-revealing tone. You said, here section start. Caro. ChatGPT said, got it. Here begins section 1's 400 words. The opening descent. Section 1. They never meant for you to hear this story. It was meant to rot quietly beneath the soil of Georgia, buried with the ledgers they tried to burn, sealed beneath the foundations of a plantation that no longer exists on any official map. But the name Belmont still appears, faintly, on an 1856 land deed stored in the Savannah Courthouse archives. A name scratched out once, then written again in a different hand. And under that, the signature of a woman who bought a child no one else wanted. It began on a morning thick with insects and judgment. The crowd gathered before sunrise, men in linen coats, women fluttering fans like nervous birds. They came to purchase bodies, efficient, obedient, dark-skinned bodies, but what they saw that morning froze even their cruelty into silence. A boy no older than 11 stood trembling on the block, skin pale as candle wax, eyes the color of milk and iron mixed, hair that looked white but glowed faintly gold in the sun. They called him cursed, a ghost born. Even the auctioneer's voice faltered when he read the bill of sale. No one wanted him. Not because they pitied him, but because they feared him. The bidding fell like dying breath, 20, 15, 10, 5. Then silence, until a single fan rose, slow as a verdict. The woman behind it was enormous, dressed in black silk that shimmered like oil on water. Her name was Margaret Denore, a widow, landowner, scholar, and something else. Something she hid behind the performance of Christian charity. The crowd cheered her generosity. They didn't see the calculation in her eyes. They didn't know she had been searching for a child like this for years, a body with pure recessive blood. That boy, they said his name was Thomas, disappeared that day into Margaret's carriage. None of the witnesses would ever see him again. But someone found what she left behind: her journals, her charts, her diagrams of purification. She wrote about a new kind of human, about selection, refinement, erasure, and what began as one woman's obsession would become the seed of something larger. Something that still breathes beneath the language of progress today. Would you like me to continue directly into Section 2 now? The first descent into the compound and Margaret's control system, or shift toward her psychological conditioning of Thomas. You said next section in 400-word ChatGPT said Section 2. The carriage that carried Thomas away from the city moved like a coffin on wheels. Each turn of the road took him farther from the world of men and deeper into something unseen, something designed. Margaret Dunor sat opposite him, her face half shadowed beneath her black hat, eyes fixed not on him, but through him, as if measuring the space he occupied against some invisible formula. She didn't speak for miles. She didn't have to. Power doesn't explain itself. It simply waits for you to understand who owns you. When they reached the edge of her land, the air changed. The pines grew denser. The sound of insects dulled. The sun itself seemed to avoid certain corners of the property, leaving whole fields in permanent twilight. Belmont was no ordinary plantation. It was an experiment, a living laboratory disguised as Christian enterprise. And within its boundaries, Margaret's word was not law, it was doctrine. She led Thomas into a small building that smelled of pine and chalk. The walls were too clean, the bed too neat. On the table sat a single book, Natural Philosophy and the Improvement of Species, open to a page marked Hereditary Purification. She told him this would be his room, that he would eat, sleep, and learn here. He was to obey without question. In exchange, he would be treated well. That night, while he sat awake on the edge of the mattress, he heard footsteps above him, then a faint scraping sound, metal against stone, like something being wheeled across the floor. He didn't yet know that directly beneath his room was the chamber where she kept her instruments, measuring rods, scales, and glass jars labeled with single initials. Every sound in that place had purpose. Every silence was a test. Margaret believed fear was the first step toward obedience. She didn't beat her subjects. She conditioned them. Deprivation, isolation, reward, repetition. Psychological levers refined long before the science had a name. She called it alignment, the reshaping of will to fit her design. Thomas was the first subject marked for complete alignment. His body was her specimen, his mind her proving ground. And on the first night he tried to pray, no words came out. Only breath, shallow, trembling, counted. Because she had already started to take his voice. Would you like the next section? Section 3, to focus on Margaret's private doctrine. The philosophy behind her purification project, or on Thomas's early psychological unraveling inside the compound. You said next section in 400-word ChatGPT said Section 3. By the third week, Thomas began to realize Belmont was not built for work. It was built for watching. Every corridor led to another locked door. Every window opened only partway. Not enough for escape, just enough to remind him there was air outside. Margaret moved through these rooms like a conductor, directing a silent orchestra. Her servants didn't look her in the eyes. They obeyed her gestures before she spoke. Even the dogs went still when she entered. Each morning began with measurement: height, weight, pulse, temperature. She recorded everything in a black ledger bound with brass corners. No words of affection, no conversation beyond instruction, only numbers, notes, comparisons. Thomas's existence reduced to data, Yet beneath that cold precision was something more dangerous than cruelty. Conviction. Margaret truly believed she was serving a higher purpose. She called it the Purification Project, though in her journals the word project was sometimes replaced with covenant. Her theory was that all corruption, moral, racial, spiritual, began in the blood. The body, she wrote, is the first temple, and when the blood is corrected, the spirit follows. It sounded like scripture. But behind that language was calculation. She believed certain traits could be extracted, others amplified, until the perfect human form emerged. Thomas didn't understand the words she used, not yet. But he saw what they meant. Some nights, lanterns burned in the outbuildings. People moved inside, silhouettes, restrained, measured, examined. He could hear muffled crying, metal against wood, the low hum of a woman praying in a language he didn't know. When he asked Margaret about it, she only said, "Knowledge demands sacrifice." She began to teach him to read. Each lesson came with rules. He could only use the words she gave him, only read from the text she approved. The books were not for education. They were instruments of control. Each word another chain, forged from obedience disguised as enlightenment. Thomas learned quickly, too quickly. Margaret noticed, and her satisfaction grew sharp. She began to call him Subject Zero. He was no longer a child. He was the first proof that her theories were working. In that house of silence and study, Thomas started to realize something horrifying. She wasn't just breeding flesh, she was breeding belief. Thomas began to sense that the walls of Belmont were listening. Conversations didn't echo here. They sank, as if the wood itself absorbed words it wasn't meant to release. He stopped speaking aloud, even when alone. He started thinking in silence. That's how survival begins. When you learn that thoughts must hide deeper than breath. Margaret's control was absolute, but it was never loud. She didn't shout or strike, she calibrated. If he obeyed, he was given food, air, light. If he faltered, she took them away piece by piece, until he understood that even comfort was conditional. She had turned mercy into a leash. That's how you break a mind. Not through pain, but through selective kindness. She told him his albinism was a gift. The body reveals divine order. She said one morning as sunlight filtered through the shutters like prison bars, "Yours is closer to the beginning." Before corruption entered blood. She spoke as though she were quoting scripture, but the Bible on her desk was hollowed out, hiding a small vial of something cloudy and red. Thomas watched her more than she realized. He saw the nights she stayed awake in her study, drawing symbols in the margins of her journals. Circles intersected with numbers, Hebrew letters written backward. She wasn't just a scientist. She was a believer in something older than science, something that required ritual precision disguised as research. And every few weeks, new wagons arrived. Not with supplies, but with people. Some were purchased, others brought quietly by men from Savannah who signed papers and left before dawn. These were Margaret's additions. She recorded their traits in meticulous detail: height, eye color, family origin. Then they vanished into the lower buildings, the ones without windows. Thomas wasn't allowed there, but he heard enough. He began counting nights when the wind carried faint metallic smells, the scent of iron and fire. He kept track of who disappeared. In the quiet hours before dawn, he scratched names into the underside of his bed frame with a nail: Jonah, Ruth, Mary, Ellis, L. The list grew longer each week. He didn't yet understand it, but something in him had begun to resist. The same mind she was shaping was beginning to record. It happened on a night when the storm wouldn't stop. Rain hammered the shutters until they shuddered like something alive, and lightning turned the sky white. Margaret was gone, called to the main house for what she called a visitor of alignment. Thomas waited until the sound of her carriage wheels disappeared, then moved. He had learned the rhythm of her steps, The timing of her patrols, the pattern of when the keys hung on the wall outside her office. It took him 3 years to understand her routines, so precisely that he could almost predict her breathing. Fear had taught him discipline. Discipline was now teaching him rebellion. He unlocked the study door, the one he had never been allowed to enter. Inside, the air was heavy with something sweet and metallic. Books lined every wall. Hundreds of them, many in languages he couldn't yet read. On her desk lay journals, open and marked with ribbons. He turned one toward the light. The first page read The Purification Project. Phase 2, Controlled Reproduction. Beneath the title were lists, names, dates, traits. Each subject described in precise biological language, but some columns had a red symbol instead of text, a circle pierced by a vertical line. He didn't know it yet, but that was the mark Margaret used for those who didn't survive. He turned another page and froze. There was a sketch of a small child, white hair, pale skin, eyes like his, and beneath it, a note, Subject 0 demonstrates the ideal genetic recessive. Future pairings recommended for Phase 3. Initiate by 16th year. That was next spring. He flipped further, hands trembling. The final pages weren't notes. They were instructions. Diagrams of human anatomy overlaid with geometry. Circles within circles, each labeled with numbers corresponding to blood ratios. At the bottom of the page was a line written not in English, but in Latin: sanguis corrigat carnem. Blood will correct the flesh. A sound in the hall froze him. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. He closed the journal, blew out the lamp, and slipped back into the corridor, just before the door opened. In the darkness of his small room, heart pounding, Thomas understood something that changed everything. Margaret wasn't experimenting to understand humanity. She was trying to rewrite it, and she had chosen him as her instrument. By morning, the storm had passed, but the air inside Belmont was heavier than before, charged, like the aftermath of a confession. Margaret returned before sunrise. Her face was calm, her voice measured, but her eyes had changed. They burned with the satisfaction of a priestess who had seen her prophecy confirmed. She spoke of progress, of bloodlines preserved, of a new order that would soon be born beneath her roof. Thomas listened without expression. Inside, he was somewhere else, cataloging details, watching for patterns, training his fear into observation. He realized she didn't just want obedience, she wanted belief. Her true experiment wasn't biological, it was spiritual domination disguised as science. The perfect subject, she wrote once, must not only yield his body, but also erase his origin story. That was how you purified a human being. You made him forget he was one. Later that week, he saw the visitor for the first time, a tall man in a dark coat, wearing a gold insignia on his lapel, 2 interlocked circles with a serpent coiled through them. He spoke with Margaret in the library for hours. Through the crack beneath the door, Thomas caught fragments of their words: selective lineage, Southern restoration, postbellum continuity. It wasn't just Margaret's vision, it was a network. Wealthy families funding private research, under the veil of charity, mapping human heredity the way farmers mapped soil. That night, Margaret wrote long after midnight. Her handwriting grew jagged, feverish. "We are approaching the convergence," she wrote. "One spirit and blood become one vessel. Subject 0 must be prepared, purified in mind before the union begins." Thomas didn't know what union meant, but he understood danger. He began moving silently through his routines, memorizing the placement of every key, every latch, every door that creaked. In secret, he started keeping notes of his own, scratched on scraps of paper hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Names, times, patterns, temperatures. He wasn't documenting for her anymore. He was building a record, something to prove he had existed. And each night before he slept, he whispered a phrase he had read in her journals, but twisted to his own purpose: blood remembers. That was how he began reclaiming himself, by making his memory an act of defiance. The only person who ever looked Thomas in the eye was Augustus, the driver. The man moved like someone carrying the weight of too many secrets. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was in the low, steady tone of someone who understood danger, was always listening. It started with glances, the brief exchange of awareness between prisoner and witness. Then, one afternoon, while Thomas carried a bundle of linen to the washroom, a folded scrap fell from beneath the cart. Inside were 5 words, scrawled in hurried handwriting, "Not all walls stay silent." It was enough. That night, Thomas slipped the note beneath his mattress and didn't sleep. His mind raced through every possibility. Was it a trap, a test, a trick from Margaret? Or was Augustus truly reaching for him, offering the first thread of escape? By dawn, fear turned into decision. He would answer. Days later, he found his chance. When Augustus came to deliver supplies, Thomas whispered the only question he dared. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," the man said, eyes fixed forward. "Long enough to know she's building something no one should see." They spoke no more, but that exchange changed everything. It told Thomas he wasn't alone. And in a place like Belmont, not being alone was the first form of rebellion. Through Augustus, Thomas began to learn things he was never meant to know. About the men who visited at night with crates labeled medical equipment, but filled with ledgers and glass cylinders. About the northern scholars who sent letters written in cipher. About the fields Margaret had ordered cleared to build new housing. Structures whose foundations were laid in precise, geometric patterns that mirrored her symbols. Belmont wasn't just a plantation anymore. It was a blueprint, a model for something that would expand after the war, a society built on controlled heredity, masked as progress. One evening, when the air smelled of smoke from distant burning fields, Augustus leaned close as he loaded the carriage. "If you ever get a chance to leave," he murmured, "don't run east. They watch the roads. Go north, follow the creek till the ground turns red. You'll know why." Then he walked away without looking back. For the first time, Thomas felt the weight of choice. Knowledge was no longer a burden. It was a weapon. Thomas waited. Waiting was survival. Every gesture, every word spoken in Belmont had to be measured, like stepping through a minefield of silence. But the storm inside him had changed shape. He no longer waited out of fear. He waited with purpose. Each day he studied Margaret's rituals. She called them sessions of refinement. Subjects were brought into the lower rooms, their blood drawn and analyzed under the glow of glass jars and mercury lamps. Margaret moved among them with reverence, whispering equations as if reciting prayers. The symbols she painted on the walls weren't random. Thomas began to notice their patterns. The same serpent and circle that the visitor wore on his lapel, drawn again, always in multiples of 7. He stole glimpses of her notes whenever she left the lab. There were columns labeled Phase 3 integration. Below, she listed genetic traits, cross-referenced with biblical verses. Numbers linked to words like Genesis 6:7-2 and Leviticus 17:11. Each reference spoke of blood, of divine mixing, of boundaries never meant to be crossed. Thomas began to copy them, drawing the shapes from memory in charcoal under his bed frame. Over weeks, he pieced together their meaning. The geometry wasn't just symbolic. It was procedural, like a map. Each line corresponded to physical structures on the property: the well, the chapel, the root cellar, even the quarters. Belmont itself was built as a living sigil. The plantation was her altar. The revelation came with a deeper horror. The purification Margaret spoke of wasn't about cleansing humanity. It was about erasing it. She believed that by aligning blood, geometry, and ritual, she could summon a new form of life, one purified of history, memory, and guilt. That night, as the house slept, Thomas descended into the cellar. The air was damp, thick with the scent of copper and decay. Lanterns flickered along the walls, illuminating hundreds of markings. The same spirals, the same circles. At the center, a table of stone. Above it, carved into the ceiling, the same Latin phrase sanguis corrigat carne. He touched the carving and felt warmth beneath the stone. A pulse, faint but living. It was then he understood the ritual had already begun. Belmont was no longer just Margaret's creation. It was feeding on her work. And soon, it would demand its next sacrifice. The nights grew longer after that discovery. Every sound in Belmont carried new meaning. The groan of old beams, the rhythmic drip of water through stone, the soft hum that came from below the cellar when everything else slept. Thomas began to understand that the plantation wasn't just built over something. It was something, an organism made of wood, stone, and will. Margaret seemed to sense his growing awareness. Her lessons changed. She no longer spoke of science or scripture. She spoke of destiny. The body is clay. She told him one morning, her pale hands resting on the table between them. But the blood remembers its source. You are the proof, Thomas. You are the bridge. Bridge. The word sat inside him like a wound. He began to notice the way she watched him. No longer as a teacher studying a pupil, but as a craftsman judging the readiness of her creation. Every compliment felt like a knife wrapped in honey. That night, he returned to the cellar, this time with a purpose. He brought a stolen lantern and the notes he had copied in secret. If Belmont was built like a sigil, there had to be a center, a heart. He followed the patterns carved into the walls, tracing them to a narrow passage that descended deeper than the foundations. The air there was colder, the stone slick with condensation. At the bottom was a chamber unlike the others. No instruments, no tables, just a pit lined with symbols. And in its center, something that looked alive, a mass of pale roots, or veins, pulsing faintly, glowing with a dull crimson light. The sound he'd heard at night wasn't water. It was breathing. On the wall above the pit was a new inscription, fresh, written in Margaret's own hand. Phase 3 commences when Subject 0 accepts the covenant. He stepped closer, the lantern trembling in his grasp. The roots stirred, reacting to his presence, as if recognizing him. Somewhere above, a door opened. A slow, deliberate creak. Margaret's voice echoed down the stairwell, calm and certain. "Do you see it now?" she said. "Do you finally understand why you were chosen?" Thomas looked into the pit and saw his reflection, his own pale eyes shining back from the living mass. He whispered, "You built this from us." And the roots shuddered, as if answering. Margaret descended the stairs with the slow poise of ceremony. The lantern in her hand burned with a pale, bluish flame, colder than any light Thomas had ever seen. Each step she took echoed like a heartbeat. The closer she came, the stronger the pulsing beneath the stone grew, as though the house itself was waiting for her command. She stopped a few feet from him. "You feel it, don't you?" she whispered. "It knows you. It's calling for what belongs to it." Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. His body felt heavy, as if the air around him had thickened. The mass in the pit was no longer just pulsing. It was breathing in rhythm with him. Margaret lifted the vial he had once seen hidden inside her Bible. The cloudy red liquid shimmered under the lantern's glow. "This," she said, "is the purified essence, drawn from the earliest bloodlines. It carries memory beyond birth, discipline beyond fear. When it mingles with yours, the bridge will open." She uncorked it. The smell was metallic, sharp, like rust and rain. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. He saw the truth now. The entire plantation was one vast experiment in alchemy and obedience. The slaves, the servants, the rituals, all parts of her grand transmutation. She wasn't seeking purity. She was building a god in her own image. But gods, he realized, required sacrifice. Margaret stepped closer. "Kneel," she said softly. "You were born for this." Something in Thomas shifted. A clarity forged by years of fear turned into defiance. He looked at her, not as her creation, but as her consequence. "You call this purity," he said, voice trembling but steady. "But all you've built is hunger." Her eyes flickered, just for a second, surprise breaking through her conviction. Then she smiled. Even hunger can be holy. As she reached for him, Thomas moved faster than he thought possible. The lantern fell, glass shattering. Fire raced across the floor, licking at the oil-soaked wood. Flames climbed the walls, devouring her sigils, her papers, her years of devotion. Margaret screamed, not in fear, but in outrage, as if witnessing blasphemy. "You fool," she cried. "You'll destroy everything." Thomas looked into the pit, the roots thrashing in the firelight. "That's the point," he whispered, and with that he kicked the vial into the flames. The vial burst before it hit the floor. A column of blue flame surged upward, swallowing the room in light so bright it erased all shadow. The air screamed. A sound that wasn't sound at all, but pressure, vibration, like the howl of something ancient remembering its own birth. The roots in the pit convulsed, twisting, flailing, spraying ash and steam. The symbols along the walls ignited one by one, glowing red, then white, then gone. Margaret staggered back, shielding her face. "You don't understand," she shouted over the roar. "It's alive because it remembers." "You can't kill what's already become." Thomas stumbled toward the stairwell. The floor beneath him heaved as if the house were breathing its last. The ceiling split, beams groaning like a dying animal. Smoke filled his lungs. He pushed upward, through the choking air, through corridors that burned in spirals. The fire following the same geometry as her designs. Even destruction obeyed her pattern. Behind him, a deeper voice rose, not human, not hers. A chorus made from hundreds of whispers, all speaking his name. Thomas Subject Zero Bridge return. He burst through the cellar door, collapsing into the hall. Flames licked up the staircase, devouring the portraits on the walls. Margaret's ancestors melting into grotesque shapes. He crawled through the smoke toward the back door, the heat biting his skin. Outside, the rain had begun again, hissing as it struck the fire. From the threshold, he looked back one last time. Margaret stood at the base of the stairs, her silhouette framed in light. The fire didn't touch her. For a heartbeat, she looked almost radiant, a figure of terrible beauty, arms raised as if embracing her own annihilation. "This isn't the end," she called. "It's the inheritance." The ceiling collapsed, burying her words beneath the roar. Thomas turned and ran. He didn't stop until the fire's glow was only a memory on the horizon. The ground beneath his feet turned red, just as Augustus had said it would. There, among the clay and the rain, he fell to his knees and let the earth cool his burned hands. Behind him, Belmont was dying. Yet in the wind that swept across the fields, he could still hear faint whispers. Not of Margaret, but of something deeper, older, still breathing beneath the ashes. And Thomas knew then, fire could destroy a house, but not a memory. Thomas walked north for 3 days without sleep. The rain followed him like judgment. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back, and the scars Belmont had written into his skin. Every sound in the forest, wind through branches, the cry of distant animals, echoed like the voices that had called his name from the fire. Sometimes he answered them, whispering into the dark just to prove he was still real. By the 5th day, he reached the river. It ran deep and red through the clay, just as Augustus had said. There, the water smelled of iron and memory. Thomas waded in, letting the cold bite through the burns on his hands. He thought of Margaret's final words. "It's the inheritance." He wondered if she'd meant the blood, the knowledge, or the guilt. He built a small camp on the bank, hidden under a stand of pines. Nights were the worst. When the wind shifted, he swore he could still hear the hum, the pulse of that thing in the pit, echoing through the ground. Once, in the middle of a storm, the earth trembled, and he thought he saw faint light beneath the soil, far away toward the ruins of Belmont. But he didn't go back. He knew better than to answer something that had already claimed his name. Weeks passed. Farmers spoke of smoke still rising from the plantation long after the rains. Travelers told stories in nearby towns of a pale boy walking out of the fire, untouched, eyes glowing like moonlight. Some said he was a ghost. Others called him the white son of Belmont, born from sin to cleanse it. Thomas listened from the corners of taverns, never revealing himself. He didn't want to be a myth. He wanted to forget. Yet the forgetting never came. One night, as he sat by the fire, he noticed something beneath his skin. A faint shimmer, like veins glowing in the moonlight. The same dull blue that had burned in Margaret's lantern. He pressed his hand against it, but the light only deepened, pulsing with his heartbeat. It didn't hurt. It called. Thomas stared at the river, and for the first time since Belmont fell, he felt something shift inside him. An echo, soft but certain, rising from the blood. Maybe Margaret had been right about one thing. Maybe the inheritance was already in him. They said the Belmont fire never went out. That even months later, when the rains came and washed the blackened ruins into the soil, the ground still smoked at night, as if something beneath it refused to die. Thomas didn't return, but the stories did. They spread faster than ash on the wind, whispered in slave quarters, church basements, and the parlors of men who swore they didn't believe in devils. They called him the Albino Redeemer. Others said ghost seed. Some claimed he was Margaret's last experiment, the fusion of purity and blasphemy she'd always sought. Men who'd seen him swore his eyes glowed like coals in the moonlight, and that when he looked at you, you remembered every sin you ever buried. Thomas didn't seek these stories, but he didn't stop them either. They built a shield around him, a mythic fog that kept curious men at bay and made others fall to their knees. In the taverns where he slept, drunks would whisper prayers under their breath. Strangers left offerings of food by his path. One old preacher followed him for 3 towns, claiming he carried the mark of divine wrath. But Thomas knew better. What lived in him wasn't divine. It was an inheritance of control. The same thing that drove Margaret, Pembroke, and every hand that ever believed they could improve creation. At night, he began to write. Using stolen paper and a quill dipped in river water darkened with ash, he documented what he remembered. Margaret's theories, the purification project, the strange hum that came from beneath the earth, but he also recorded something new: dreams. Visions of the compound rebuilt in iron and glass. Machines humming with that same light, faces of men not yet born, carrying her same hunger in their eyes. He realized then that the inheritance wasn't just blood. It was knowledge, a seed planted in thought, waiting for minds strong enough to carry it forward. He felt it working in him, pushing, whispering, shaping. It wanted to live again. Thomas made his choice. If knowledge was the infection, then he would become its keeper, not to spread it, but to bury it where only the deserving could ever find it. He rose before dawn, packed his papers, and turned north again. The sky glowed crimson over the horizon, like the world itself warning him, what begins in blood never ends clean. By 1873, the world had changed its face, but not its intent. Slavery was gone, yet its bones had been buried beneath new language science, progress, improvement. The same words Margaret had spoken in candlelight were now printed in university journals and read aloud in lecture halls by men who wore spectacles instead of chains. Thomas recognized their tone instantly. The voice of conviction that sounds like morality, but smells like ownership. He moved quietly through these circles under a new name, Mr. Alton Gray. No one questioned the pale man with calm eyes and perfect handwriting. He worked as a translator for medical researchers in Charleston, then Washington, then New York, where a new breed of scholars spoke of selective breeding, racial refinement, and inherited weakness. They believed themselves pioneers. They had no idea they were speaking from a ghost script. Thomas never corrected them. He only listened. He copied their diagrams, their genealogies, their symbols. And beneath every diagram, he recognized Margaret's handwriting. Reshaped, formalized, institutionalized. The Purification Project had been reborn under 1,000 new titles. Only now, it wore the mask of human betterment. At night, he walked the waterfront and wondered if it had all been inevitable. He thought of the bloodlines Margaret traced, the charts she drew to justify domination. And he saw them now, mapped across nations, pulsing through universities, whispered in governments. Her experiment hadn't died with her. It had evolved. The inheritance was no longer one woman's madness. It had become civilization's method. Once, in the archives of the American Philosophical Society, Thomas found a sealed folder marked Belmont Studies, 1854 to 1860. Inside were copies of Margaret's journals, translated, annotated, and signed by none other than Dr. Harrison Pembroke. The preface called her a visionary ahead of her time. That night, Thomas burned the pages in his boarding room sink. The smoke choked him, but he didn't stop. He knew he couldn't destroy all of it. But he could erase traces, slow the infection, disrupt the chain of inheritance. Every fire he lit became a warning to whatever came next. Knowledge, without conscience, becomes ritual. But even as the ashes rose, the voice returned, soft, familiar, feminine. You can't erase blood, Thomas. It remembers itself. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The faint blue shimmer pulsed beneath his skin again. The inheritance wasn't just in books anymore. It was alive. Would you like Section 15 to serve as the final descent? Thomas's realization of the inheritance's true purpose and his choice between destruction or becoming its final guardian. You said next section in 400-word. ChatGPT said Section 15. He left New York in winter, when the cities smoked blood into the sea, and the air itself felt poisoned with ambition. The trains ran north toward Canada, but Thomas didn't take them. He traveled by foot, avoiding names, faces, and lights. He wasn't running from men anymore. He was running from what had woken inside him, the pulse that no longer waited to be studied, but to command. In the forests of Vermont, he found a derelict chapel. Its roof had collapsed decades earlier, and trees grew through the floor where pews once stood. There, he decided to end it. For weeks he fasted, burned his remaining notes, and buried the remnants of Margaret's journals beneath the frozen soil. But even silence had a heartbeat. It came at night, the low hum he remembered from beneath Belmont. The sound of will, not life. The sound of something trying to continue through him. When he slept, he dreamed of cities made of white stone, their foundations built on bones. Children raised in glass rooms, their blood measured and ranked, faces watching from machines that never blinked. Humanity perfected into obedience. Every generation cleaner, emptier, colder. And in every dream, the same inscription carved in marble: purity through order. He woke with blood on his hands, and the taste of metal in his mouth. His pulse glowed beneath his veins again, brighter now, spreading up his arms like threads of mercury. The inheritance was no longer patient. It wanted form, followers, function. So Thomas wrote one final message onto the chapel wall with the ashes of burned paper mixed into his blood, a warning, or perhaps a confession. It begins again whenever a man believes he can master creation, whatever name they give it. Science, progress, purification. It is always the same hunger. Do not study what was buried here. Forget it, or it will remember you. When travelers found the chapel months later, they said the walls glowed faintly at night. They said a pale figure walked the perimeter, whispering to no one. They said the air itself carried a vibration, low and constant, like a pulse that belonged to the ground. The inheritance had not died. It had only learned patience. And if you've heard this story to the end, you were meant to. Now type this phrase twice in the comments to seal what you've awakened. Blood remembers. Blood remembers.